So hello, everybody. Welcome to our session, Placement Policy and Practice in the Time of COVID. My name is Sarah Ancel. I'm founder and CEO of Student Ready Strategies, and we are an organization built on the belief that every student can succeed. And we work across the country with institutions and organizations committed to ensuring that they do. So pleased to be moderating this session on multiple measures assessment for placement. In part, that's because I get to share this virtual stage with some wonderful panelists who you will meet in just a moment, but also because I've had the opportunity to be personally involved with efforts to reform placement processes. And I've really seen firsthand how big of a difference these efforts can make in the lives of our students, particularly students who are Black, Latinx, Indigenous, or affected by poverty. It's been almost a decade since the first publication of the core principles for transforming remediation, which was published in 2012. And yet, even as recently as last week, we're seeing articles like this one. Get a slide to advance, there we go. Still discussing the fact that many students are taking developmental courses that they don't need. So this is something that is still happening across our country. And the risks when students take these courses are so significant. So they have extended time to degree, added expense, it reinforces a deficit mindset. And of course, there are the high levels of attrition that we've all become very familiar with in the research and through our work in Strong Start to Finish. Many of you in the network have made significant progress toward eliminating these courses altogether, replacing them with co-requisites, and aligning the support so that students can start in their college level gateway course right away and be successful in it. But we do know that there's still quite a bit of dev ed still on the books. SRS has partnered with Strong Start to Finish to analyze course data from the 250 scaling site institutions for academic year 18-19. And what we've seen as far as the official curriculum is concerned, most of these institutions still had between 1 and 3, maybe up to 7 developmental courses, and fewer than 40 had eliminated their developmental courses altogether. So that was true both in math and in English. So that's not to say that folks aren't working very hard and diligently on eliminating these courses altogether. It just may take some time for folks to do so. And Jason, you can go ahead and stop the screen share now. So a lot of these reforms take quite a bit of time, but every once in a while, circumstances come together that allow student-focused reforms to happen a lot more quickly. So our session title is focused on in a time of COVID. So we're in a really unique situation now for 2 reasons, but COVID related and not COVID related. So we saw all sorts of testing disruptions due to COVID, but at the same time, we're seeing institutions and systems going to test optional for admissions. And we see evidence continue to mount about the inequities in our testing system and our exams' limited utility in predicting college performance. So all of this happening all at once not only has forced us to re-examine placement, it's also shown us how quickly we can make changes to it when we need to. So if eliminating developmental education, you can't do that overnight perhaps, but we can quickly deploy new placement policies in this environment and use it as a tool to provide students with greater access to gateway courses and help them avoid all those risks associated with that standalone remediation or dev ed. So I'm joined today by 4 professionals who have been leading efforts to reform their placement policies. They're here to talk about how they've used this tool to achieve greater equity and improve their student outcomes. And just a note for the folks in the audience, we encourage questions. We've reserved time at the end of the session for them, but you don't have to wait till the end of the session to submit them. You can submit them as they occur to you. Please just use the chat box in the conference platform. And Erin Winery from ECS is actively monitoring that for us. So now I will turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves, and we're going to start with Beth.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so my name is Elizabeth or Beth Kopko. I'm a senior research associate at the Community College Research Center, which is based out of Teachers College, Columbia University in New York. In my current role, I, among other things, lead our center's portfolio on multiple measures, assessment, and placement practices and policies. For those who might be less familiar with CCRC, our work on multiple measures really spans a range of different projects, including several ongoing experimental studies in New York, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, as well as descriptive exploratory research initiatives that are looking to better understand and document the range of placement policies that are being implemented across the country before, during, and hopefully after COVID. And in addition to these research initiatives on multiple measures, CCRC is also leading several projects aimed at really providing technical assistance and guidance to colleges, states, or systems who are interested in multiple measures placement, and really just trying to help practitioners understand the best practices in that space.
Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Rathert. There you go. I'm the Assistant Director of P20 and College Readiness for the Minnesota State College and University System. We're a large comprehensive state system comprised of 32-year colleges, 7 universities across 54 campuses. I have been coordinating the development and implementation of our inaugural multiple measures course placement framework, which is set to implement next fall. And I also helped develop the interim course placement guidance being used this year in light of the pandemic.
Hi, I'm Mel Baker. I'm an assistant commissioner in academic affairs at the Louisiana Board of Regents. I do many things related to academic affairs and many different hats, but I would say my role connected to placement has to be related to our work due to the emergency COVID policies that we came out with in light of the pandemic for academic affairs. And then also my work with the strategy sites with our initiative Math Board.
Hi, I'm Sarah Truelsch. I'm the Director of Policy Research for the City University of New York, the CUNY system. We're a system of 25 institutions, 18 of which serve undergraduates, all located within New York City. And we've been taking on comprehensive remediation reform at the system level for the last 5 years or so. That's included a really intensive reimagining of the way that we do placement practices.
All right, well, before we dive in too deeply to what you all have done to change your placement, I want to really start by thinking about the students and talking about why you wanted to change placement to begin with. So what did you hope to see in terms of the student experience or student outcomes as a result of your work on placement? And I'm going to start with Sarah on that one.
So I mentioned that we've been working as a system on remediation reform for about 5 years now. And a lot of that work stems from looking at the results that we were getting. Honestly, a lot of it stems from the great research that was coming out of the Community College Research Center and our colleagues there. A lot of what we are hearing nationally in terms of diagnosing poor outcomes and poor results from remedial courses in traditional formats, we found evidence for in our own system. And in particular, when we looked at students who went through remediation and how many of them went on to be successful in credit-bearing courses, we found that less than half of the students who were assigned to math remediation ever completed any credit-bearing math course in the course of 2 years after they'd entered college. So even just by its own standards, whatever we had been doing historically in terms of math remediation wasn't working to get students college ready. And on top of that, drawing on the emerging evidence base from research and from other people experimenting in the field, we had reasons to think that a lot of what we were doing in remediation might have been at the best unnecessary, if not actively harmful to students. So as we began thinking about a suite of changes and reforms that we could make to the ways that students were assigned to developmental courses, the way that we delivered developmental sorts, the way that we thought about students demonstrating that they no longer needed developmental courses, the metric that we've really looked at to gauge the success of all of these things is the percentage of students who are actually earning credit in a math course or earning credit in a gateway English course, and ideally within 1 year of entering. So we're looking to have more access to those courses, either directly with no developmental requirements whatsoever, or in the form of prerequisite supports, and then more students actually earning credit.
Yeah, so in Minnesota, I feel like many of the same things as Sarah just described. There's a lot of parallels there. We had a legislative mandate, and that mandate really specified that we needed to decrease the number of students placing into developmental education and increase the number of students completing their college gateway courses. So that was somewhat sort of a frame for the work that followed. And then I would say we just layered onto that the desire to eliminate equity gaps across students of color, white students, Pell eligible, non-Pell eligible students, first gen, non-first gen. And when you look at our outcomes data, it's pretty telling. We have about 40% of students enrolling in developmental education. We can't really track placement in the current state, but we anticipate placement into DevEd is even higher. And so there are students who are placing into it that just never take a course. And so that is a barrier right there. And then we know from various research that those students who, especially placing into the bottom levels of developmental education, at least in those traditional sequences, they never make it through to the gateway course. And there's a lot of costs incurred and student debt and so on. So, so that is one thing we're hoping to address. And I think the other thing is, you know, we have about 18% of students, all students completing a college gateway math course by the end of their first year, which is terrible. But it gets even more woeful once you get into the disaggregated data. And so we have about 1 in 10 Black or African American students completing a college gateway math course by the end of their first year. And it's really not that much better for our Hispanic Latinx students or our Indigenous Native American students. And so that's something we need to address. And so our hope is that, you know, we develop a model and a strategy that closes those gaps and helps more students complete those college gateway courses by the end of their first year.
Yep. So Mellynn, you mentioned at the beginning that you came into this work during COVID and as a result of COVID. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how that came about, and then what does your emergency placement policy look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say Louisiana's shift in their placement policy and really our dual enrollment as well as admissions policy was all just in response to the cancellation of standardized tests. All of our policies depended on standardized tests. And so we wanted to make sure we responded swiftly to make sure that our students still had options and placement policy choices out there since we set the minimum standards at the Board of Regents. And so timeline wise, in terms of policy was at a rapid pace that I don't know if any of us were as used to. So by mid-March, all of our institutions are, you know, going to remote learning. We're doing our shutdown. By April 16th, we had our first webinar. Little did we know that was going to become the first of many, but our first webinar to discuss all of our emergency policies. And so we moved pretty quickly to make sure that our institutions had those options. And so the shift in the policy in response to COVID allowed for metrics that were not previously in our placement policy. And so that included high school curriculum, class rank, and co-requisite placement. We had prior pre-pandemic, which is an interesting term I'll use. Pre-pandemic, we did have a pilot co-requisite, and I apologize, my light keeps turning off. We had a pilot co-requisite portion into our policy, but it was only in a pilot standpoint. And so we put that into our emergency policy. And this will end at the end of this academic year. And so we have an opportunity to really kind of dig into the data and see kind of what effect that this had. So we really, Louisiana didn't emerge into this conversation until standardized tests were no longer, or as readily available, I should say.
What about you, Greg, Sarah? What does your new placement policy look like? And did that change because of COVID? You're both muted right now, so we'll go to Sarah first.
So we've been working to revise our placement policy for a couple of years now. We've had a process in place for decades in which students could demonstrate college readiness using either SAT, ACT scores or scores on statewide high school exams, or if they haven't met either of those, take a placement test on campus. And what we've been working on the last couple of years is doing away with those on-campus placement tests and instead having a new measure that incorporated high school grades combined with SAT and high school state exams if students had them to make a final placement determination. We rolled that out for the first time for spring 2020 term. So our new students coming in for spring 2020 were placed by our new system that didn't have on-campus placement testing. So it was completely fortuitous that that's also the term that we had to switch to remote instruction, close the campuses down, close all the testing centers. So when we were preparing for admissions and letting new students in for fall 2020 term, we just sort of fortuitously had this system that no longer required them to come to campus to take tests. So that was purely coincidentally the way that that worked out. I think it was a little bit of a shot in the arm for our efforts to do. So anyone who may have doubted our efforts to do away with placement testing before was certainly happy that we had done so when the pandemic came. So our basic system is in place. We have had to shift it around a little bit, as Mellynn said, because of the availability of standardized test scores going forward. So as we're preparing to allow new students to come in for our fall 2021 admissions, our system stopped collecting SAT scores. So we had to rejigger a lot of our formulas to not use SAT scores in the same way. So we had completed a lot of our big plans for changes before the pandemic, but the pandemic has still affected the way that we do some operational things.
Great. How about you, Greg?
I feel like there's so many parallels. So I won't backtrack into maybe all of our history, but just to say this has been like a 10-year journey. Higher ed, the pace of change, right? And so we started as an AccuPlacer only system, and then became kind of that either or logic of ACT, SAT, our state K-12 assessment called the MCAs, or AccuPlacer. And then we were all set to launch a multiple measures framework that would layer in high school GPA and move from that either or logic into a both and logic and a decision band model. And then the pandemic hit, and so we shifted gears again. And so right now we've been allowing our colleges and universities to use standalone self-reported high school GPA. And in the absence of a valid high school GPA score within the last 10 years, to do guided self-placement. And our GPAs, we set it at 2.5 or higher for reading and writing. And then for college algebra, which is really the only math course we established a benchmark for at a system level, it's 2.8, a cumulative high school GPA of 2.8 or higher, plus completion of high school algebra 2 with a C- or higher, which almost all of our high school students have. We, I'm sorry for the background dog barking. And so we plan to transition to our multiple measures framework next fall. And I feel like we've learned some things this year that will help us in that implementation effort next fall. And so I'm actually kind of appreciative, if they're finding silver linings, right, of having this year to kind of work through some of these things so that next fall we can really hit the ground running.
So I want to turn the conversation into some research questions. And when I've worked with institutions on multiple measures, it's always the first question is, well, what measures should we look at? Which measures are going to accurately predict student success in gateway courses? So I want to turn it over to Beth to talk a little bit about the research behind what is the answer to that question?
Sure. Yeah, so I think that the research from both CCRC and elsewhere really shows that no measure does that great of job at predicting whether or not a student is going to succeed in that college level course. And when I say no measure, I'm talking about a really wide gamut of measures that we've looked into, anything from AccuPlacer and SAT to college specific homegrown tests, non-cognitive factors, and then even records of prior course taking or academic achievement. That said, I think that if you forced me to pick from the long list of not so great measures, I'd have to go with high school GPA. We see that it's the most predictive of these measures, and it really stays more predictive as compared to something like AccuPlacer for upwards of 10 years post high school graduation. So there's a lot of valuable information in there. And, one of the reasons for that being that high school GPA in and of itself is kind of like an index of multiple measures, right? Because you're not only measuring content knowledge with that grade, you're measuring things like persistence in the class and participation and motivation. So, you know, that's really why we see that measure doing better. But again, it's not better by a great magnitude. You know, the research kind of just shows us on average that it's actually only going to predict variation or give you an indication of how students will or will not succeed in that college level course by a factor of about 10 to 30%. So, yeah.
Okay. Sarah, you've been doing this for a while. Is that consistent with your experience?
Yeah, that's really similar to what we found in internal research within the CUNY system. So we've looked at comparing the predictive power of SAT scores, our statewide high school exams, which have a couple of different versions and subjects within them, AccuPlacer exams. Previously we had Compass. We also have a homegrown writing exam, and high school grades. We looked at high school grades overall and subject specific. So English grades to predict English and just math grades to predict math. What we found over and over again is that the high school grades are more predictive than any of the standardized test scores we've looked at. That's true of predicting gateway course passage rates, also true of first year GPA, retention rates, eventual graduation, any kind of academic outcome we've looked at. But as Elizabeth said, none of these measures are tremendously predictive. We sometimes for students who are at very, very high end, we can be reasonably confident that they'll do well. Anything past the very, very high end of really strong student achievement, it gets really much more difficult to have accurate predictions. So our new methods that incorporate high school grades, in addition to standardized test scores if they're available, are more predictive of eventual success in courses, but not wonderfully as much so as we might like.
So we started our day today with the fantastic keynote by Estelle Ben-Simone about all the myriad inequities that you see in our developmental education system, which includes the placement process. So what advice do you have for ensuring placement is equitable? I'm going to start with Beth on that one.
Sure. So for me, when I'm asked about equity and placement, two things really come to mind. The first is that I think it's not, when you're thinking about how you're going to build a multiple measure system or any placement system, it shouldn't be about the model or which one's most predictive or which criteria you're going to use, but rather I think that it's important to keep in mind why you're building that placement system alternative in the first place, and that's to get more people through the college level sequence. So really you want to focus on building a system that's going to, by design, push more students into the college level course. And research has shown us time and again that those types of systems are really going to have the ones that have the biggest impacts on outcomes for all students, and specifically for those students who are typically not granted access at the same level historically if they are just using the single test system. The other thing that I think comes to mind when I'm thinking about equity and placement is really about access to that system itself. So I think, you know, when you're building a multiple measure system, you're thinking about using all these alternative measures to predict success in that college level course. But I think colleges need to step back and think about who really has access to those alternative measures, right? So not only who has access, but who doesn't. So if you're building a system out that a significant portion of your student population doesn't have access to things like, you know, high school grades within a certain time frame or high school grades period, you know, what are the implications of that system? And when it comes down to it, it's really that you're kind of building a system that ends up being yet another barrier for historically marginalized students, even though the intention was not to do that.
Others have thoughts to add to that?
Yeah. I like what, sorry, I like what Beth was saying about sort of placement system and that more holistic perspective. And, you know, as an example of that, I think of math, which, you know, I pointed out earlier as sort of our most significant barrier for students. And there's equity aspects of that as well. But it's not enough just to refine or revise your math placement. You gotta be thinking about the math pathways that you've developed, having those broader curricular conversations across programs about what math is needed for the field that students are wanting to pursue, making sure that is communicated down through the advisors. And so it's just a much broader set of conversations that needs to happen to ensure that, you know, once students are placed, that they're in a pathway that aligns with their goals, because that's really what's ultimately going to have an impact for students.
Sarah,
Yeah.
did you want to add to that?
I mean, I couldn't agree more, I think, with all of those points. I think, as Beth said, we've sort of established, given that none of our measures are that predictive, I think you're going to have some version of error, and we're trying to err on the side of letting more students go directly in courses. So the burden of proof is on anything you do that's a barrier to students accessing credit-bearing courses. And I think, as we found as Beth has, that a lot of the improvement can come just by letting more students take the regular credit-bearing courses. But to Greg's point, all of the conversation, I think, is about placement, not just on its own, but placement into what. And then one of the most important things, if not the most important thing that you can do, is make sure that the interventions that you're trying to guide students to are actually worthwhile interventions. And I think that's one of the most powerful changes in this entire kind of shift in philosophy. So if you're going to be diverting students from credit-bearing courses and taking their tuition money for it, you should have a really good reason for doing so. And if you don't, then the default should be access to that credit-bearing course. And if it's, the other thing we try to think about is like the minimal dose of effective instruction. So because we're often not sure that we're actually helping students by giving them some developmental supports, at least we can guide them to the least burdensome version of that we can, unless we've got a really strong reason to believe that they'll benefit for more hours or more requirements in something that's not credit bearing.
Yeah, so I'm sure most of you know this, but the California legislation is based on that exact premise of burden of proof being on the school. So I think that mindset is continuing to sort of grow and spread across the country. We want to make sure we have time for audience questions, but I'll just do my last question for you is just what's happened? What results have you seen? What are the results of your efforts on placement? And I'll just let whoever wants to jump in on that one.
Well, I don't want to supply a non-answer, Sarah, but I will say because our policy is not done from the standpoint of we want to do a full year lookout, and when it ends at the end of this academic year, we really see this as an opportunity to review, look at the data, see the impact of a policy in Louisiana without the requirement of a standardized test. And so we're really looking forward to analyzing, digging deeper, and then see if that leads to a shift in the conversation around placement in Louisiana. So non-answer, I apologize, but we're not there yet.
We never get any instant gratification in this field, do we? Let's see, Sarah, you've run some numbers, haven't you?
Yeah, so we're still really in the early phases of actually implementing our new system that uses grades as part of the placement process. And the first term that we used that new system was spring 2020, when we also had this emergency pivot to remote instruction. So there's a lot of really complicated effects to disentangle. Even with all those disruptions, we had higher pass rates and credit earning in our math courses for the spring 2020 term than we did for the spring 2019 term under our new placement system. That's not true of English. We had sort of worse course outcomes in English, but in ways that we have evidence have a lot more to do with the pandemic and the disruption than anything related to placement. I guess, as we've said again and again, you can only blame placement for so much of what happens in classrooms. But before we implemented that system, we'd been on a multi-year path of changing our other cut points for access to credit-bearing courses that had allowed many, many more students directly to take credit-bearing courses. And we were also placing more students in credit-bearing courses through co-requisites, where we've shifted the percentage of students assigned to math remediation from 80% of incoming associate degree freshmen to 50% of associate degree freshmen over the course of about 4 years. In the course of that time, we've seen pretty rapid increases in the percentages of students earning credit. So from 3 years ago, where we had about 34% of our first-time freshmen earned any math credit in their first year, we're now up to 43%, which is far short of the goals of where we want to be of closer to 60-65%, but which is pretty rapid growth over that period of time in a way that's almost all attributed to just letting more students take the course.
And I might just add, in terms of our interim course placement guidance, that was the first time as a system we really used standalone high school GPA at scale. And what we found was that we did see a pretty significant increase, especially among students in their math placements, placing into college gateway courses. And we didn't see a corresponding decrease in their outcomes. So somewhat of a silver lining there. However, the other thing we noticed is there was no statistically significant impact on equity and closing those gaps. And so I think this is something to kind of keep in mind with high school GPA. I know there's a lot of talk and attention about GPA, and I think has been earlier relayed. It does have some limitations, and it is not sort of the magic solution to all of our challenges. And just to be cognizant of the different inequities and social injustices that high school GPA might also represent. And so that if equity truly is your aspirational goal, then it's really about that combinative approach of bringing those other measures together in a more holistic system and process, so that you're really reflecting the variability of student experiences across the different demographic groups.
Great. Well, we've got just under 10 minutes left in the session, so I want to turn it over to the audience. We are a very small group in the session, so I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but I'm going to try it anyway. So if you do have a question and you just want to show a video and unmute and just ask it and just, jump in and join the conversation, I think that would be wonderful. And Jason, I'm not sure if I need to do something to get nope, looks like Bruce, you could do that yourself without assistance. Good. So if you have any questions or you just want to talk or share your own expertise, jump in.
I want to follow up on Greg's point. So do you actually have data showing that high school GPA actually results in still disproportionate placement of students of color or low-income students and Black, Indigenous, Latinx students in developmental ed?
Yes, at least from our interim guidance. Now I should have put a huge asterisk on that, right? So any data that we're collecting over the last year and a half is pretty noisy. And so I'm careful usually about saying, it's hard to draw sort of causal relationships in that data just because there's so many confounding variables that might be at play. The shift to online learning modalities, all of the social inequities and injustices that are happening in students' lives and the impacts that might be having on students' lives. In terms of placement, just having a safe space for a student to be able to take a test if that's the route that they're going down. So there are a lot of variables, but what we tend to see, and we had pretty significant numbers, was just that there was just no impact on closing those gaps.
We had the conversation came up organically last time. I'm going to do it forcibly this time, but and Sarah, you and Greg both sort of touched on this, but the importance of not just looking at placement in a vacuum, but looking at the system that students are being placed into. Can you talk a little bit more about your thoughts and your experience around that?
Yeah, so sometimes we talk about this in our system as our comprehensive approach to reform. So we've tried to have as much as possible this conversation about how we're changing the way that we assign students to interventions. And I think I've mentioned a little bit about shifting this burden of proof from students to demonstrate that they're ready for something to interventions to demonstrate that they're actually beneficial. I've been working in college readiness for 10, 15 years now. And I think it was a really interesting revolutionary idea when we started. But in a lot of ways, we started to conflate assignment to remediation with readiness for college in a way that I think really flattened and did a disservice to both of those concepts. Because one thing it did is put so much attention on students demonstrating some set of skills and very little attention to things that were happening in colleges to demonstrate that they were actually beneficial or that we were sort of setting things in ways that were appropriate. I also think it really flattened a lot of concepts of authentic college readiness into to just being about hitting certain minimum scores in reading or math assessments in a ways that we know don't really capture the full extent of what it means to be prepared to do well in college academically, or in the much larger sense of social emotional ways that we really need for students to be successful. So we've really tried to change this conversation to be about targeting of interventions and thoroughly thinking about what it is we do for students who we have reason to believe will not have great rates of success if we put them directly into credit-bearing courses, and set out like a menu of these are the things we have for students who are close to being ready, of short kind of minimal workshops or co-requisite courses, and ideally as little additional co-requisite support as students need, or we have deeper levels of interventions. But then our placement conversation is about what are the interventions we have and who are those interventions targeted at, and then what's the band of students that each intervention is designed to serve. So it's never just a conversation about placement in and of itself or college. We try not to even use the term college readiness. It's really about what is the thing that we have to offer you that we think is the best fit for what your needs are.
I love that. In that analysis we did on the course data, we had all the course descriptions and the course names. We did a separate point of interest about this, but the use of deficit language in those developmental course names and the course descriptions themselves. I mean, I think it was like 1 in 4 or something said like the word basic either in the description or in the title. So we definitely flagged that as an issue as far as even just how we talk about our treatment for these students. So I really appreciate you flipping the script and saying, we're going to give you something extra instead of saying you're not ready for the thing that you should be ready for. Any other questions from Bruce, Wendy, Jessica, Christopher? If not, I'll ask the.
I have a question, Sarah.
Oh, yeah. Go
I
ahead,
want to
Bruce.
let everybody else have a chance, but I want to get people's reactions to what Estella said today. I just want to hear what you have to say about it, right? So this notion of redlining as an analogy, which is basically, I mean, if you extend that analogy, which is we had redlining policies, we eliminated them, but still housing patterns did not change, right? Those neighborhoods still remained segregated, and we needed to do interventions, and which we've never been good at in terms of resolving the sort of the consequences of that initial policy. And I think if I heard Estella correctly today, what she was advocating for is exactly that, right? Which is higher education skills have atrophied in terms of being able to meet the needs of these students because we've kept them out of our institutions, right? I mean, isn't that really what it's about? Like, it's both the policy change, getting rid of redlining, and it's that investment in building the capacity up to deal with the harm caused by remediation. I mean, I thought that was a fascinating way to think about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Does that make sense? Did I make any sense whatsoever? I mean,
I think you make so much sense. We're all like processing like this.
Yeah, I'll just, and this is like such an unsatisfying answer, but I also want to be honest with the fact that I think all of us had to miss like the last 10, 20 minutes of Estella's presentation to go into a green room for these. So, so we're at a little bit of a disadvantage. The first 20 minutes that I saw were incredibly inspiring. I have to feel like I have to say to respond to that, I have to start expressing some of my personal positions that are not necessarily like the formal positions of the institution that I represent, because we haven't fully worked through all of those things. But your encapsulation of the points, which is similar to what I took away, Bruce, seems to me to be about exactly right. And I think the comparison to redlining is so illustrative and so illuminating and such a smart way to approach it. And yeah, I think there are like things that we fail to do well and actual harms that higher education is responsible for having sort of done to groups of students. And I think that issues of equity, structural barriers, and implicit racism couldn't be more interwoven with all of these conversations.
Yeah,
I think too, we've had some recent conversation about how those harmful impacts are often masked under good intentions, right? And we have those conversations a lot with faculty, but of course it also You can see that across administration and our policies and so forth. But it's people wanting to protect students, and often what that means, what that operationalizes as, is wanting to, put students in developmental courses so they're fully ready by the time they get to that college gateway course, but not taking into account the realities that we see in the data, right? And that students just aren't getting to those college gateway courses. If they are, they're burdened by debt. It's taken a lot of time. Now they're kind of rethinking their goals and maybe narrowing or lowering those expectations. And that all has long-lasting impacts on those students and their communities. And so often, I think it does come back to sort of that personal interrogation of ourselves and our biases, our implicit beliefs and values. And that's hard work, and it doesn't happen overnight, right? And that's hard to codify, that's hard to put into policy, but it often takes courageous leadership to just be able to stand up and espouse the values that we endorse, and to put equity as sort of the North Star of our work, and then make sure that everything is sort of aligned to that. And it's a journey, and we're on that journey, and we're not there yet. But my hope is that as we move forward, that becomes more of the mainstream, and that becomes sort of the expectation of ourselves and our colleagues, that we're having those internal dialogues, and then we're taking that and having that dialogue collectively. And I think, events like this show that maybe we're starting to do that.
Yeah, Bruce, I'm delinquent in sending you to break, but I do want to say, I think that the redlining analogy in placement, placement's kind of the lines, but our dev ed courses are the neighborhoods. And if we don't fundamentally disrupt and change the neighborhoods themselves, which is our dev ed structure, if we're just doing placement, then we haven't changed anything really. So I think it actually works in a nice analogy for this particular session.
As always, Sarah, you come up with the easier way to say what I was trying to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of you. We have a 2-minute break now because we went a little over, but that was such a thought-provoking question. I wanted to not cut it off. So we will join back in the main room for the closing, but thank you to the panelists. Thank you to those of you who tuned in and participated, and we will wrap up our day in a couple of minutes.